place name. We talk about its history, myths, and fate. It is extremely important for our country's development. But not only settlements were renamed, it was also rivers, mountains, different places, lakes, and so on.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center, an NGO Euro-Atlantic course, and I'm your host, Miroslava Yaremkiv. Toponymy has always been an ideological tool, and no empire has ever neglected it. The Russian Empire is no exception. Marking the territory with one's own names meant confirming one's power. Practically the entire territory of Ukraine was marked with Russian toponyms of the tsarist times, and especially during the times of the USSR. In particular, Crimea underwent large-scale renaming. The Soviet authorities tried to destroy everything that was connected with the indigenous peoples of Ukraine. Not only the ethnic composition of the peninsula's population, but also toponyms were forcibly changed. Thus, Exmedjit became Simferopol, Kislev became Yevpatoria, Kiev became Feodosia, Karasu-Bazar became Belogorsk, and the large Crimean Tatar settlement Akyar became Sevastopol. In today's episode, we're going to talk about decolonization of toponyms, exploring why the restoration of the historical toponyms of Crimea is really one of the instruments of deoccupation of Crimea. If you want to learn more about the subject, please continue watching this video and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss our videos in the future. The Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine is preparing a decision that will help to put into use the restored historical names of Crimean settlements. The decision is being developed on behalf of the National Commission for the Crimean Tatar language and to implement the previously adopted law on condemnation and prohibition of propaganda of Russian imperial policy in Ukraine. The names on Ukrainian maps will be the same as on international maps. When we read Simferopol, Sevastopol, we associate them with Russia. But if we read Akyar, Exmedjit, then it will be a different perception, and people will understand that Crimea definitely does not belong to Russian Federation. We need to explain why it is necessary to return the names, and why this particular settlement was renamed. The Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and Russia were renaming Crimea with the aim of erasing memory and history. Chairman of the board of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center, Eskender Beriev, believes that we have to show that the Ukrainian approach isn't preserving history, preserving the connection of indigenous peoples with Crimea and real facts. He emphasizes that it is necessary to explain that we are not renaming, we are restoring historical names and justice. Let's take a listen.
Do you recall how Russia's political elite or political establishment reacted when Ukraine passed the Indigenous Peoples' Law? There were statements from Putin, statements from the State Duma, and secret correspondence between diplomatic Russians and Germans and French diplomats to pressure Ukraine to repeal the law. Why? Because the adoption of the Indigenous People Law was a critical step in beginning the process of decolonization, de-imperialization, and decommunization, not only in the words, but also in deeds, so that we can further demonstrate that Ukraine is an independent legal state. As a result, in the minds of the Ukrainian and international public, decolonization, de-imperialization, and decommunization of territories and narratives about Crimea is a critical principle. The next step is to restore historical justice and safeguard Ukraine's cultural heritage. In this way, we demonstrate that Ukraine is a legal state, that Ukraine is a European state, and that Ukraine truly wants to protect indigenous people's rights. True historiography about Crimea is being formed and promoted. Unfortunately, some members of this scientific and academic communities continue to conduct research using Soviet-era resources, or Russian historiography. Unfortunately, this is happening right now in independent Ukraine, which is under pressure from the occupiers' armed aggression. And indeed, we've recently demonstrated how it's happening right now when we're living through all of these processes. I'm talking about when a so-called all-Russian scientific and practical conference is being held, and many students from temporarily occupied areas, including Crimea, attend, and both Russian scientists and Gulters show students their research, their books, and how denazification will end when Ukraine as a country is destroyed. So we can see how they are creating historiography that will be passed down to future generations. When we discuss reintegration and cognitive reintegration, we must consider what makes Crimea appealing. We must show not only Ukrainian society, but also the international community that Crimea is more than just the sea. There is a sea in France, a sea in Italy, and a sea in the United States of America. However, Crimea is a very unique region in the world where you can learn about, participate in, and obtain information not only on the southern coast of Crimea, but also in the steppe of Crimea and the mountain part of Crimea. Every district in Crimea has its own story, and each of its settlements have a story to tell. Improving Ukraine's image on the international stage, the issue of restoring toponyms is a major concern for indigenous people. I'm confident that when Ukraine completes this process, it will be supported by more than 400 people, including indigenous people representatives. And, of course, states concerned with human rights will back Ukraine. In Crimea, the rule of law has been restored. We must constantly emphasize that Ukraine is a legal state that is liberating Crimea rather than seizing it. It is attempting to give all people living in the temporarily occupied areas, particularly Crimea, the right to be free and develop, and the process of restoring toponyms should already be demonstrated. Then there's the issue of preserving the link between Ukraine's indigenous peoples and Crimea. It is critical for us that the ethnogenesis of Ukraine's 3 indigenous peoples occurred on Crimean territory. When we talk about a place name, we talk about its history, myths, and fate. It is extremely important for our country's development. Keeping the indigenous language of Ukraine alive, every name has a significance. This provides an opportunity to preserve and develop the language. We must do more than make declarations to support indigenous people and preserve their languages. This is an example of how we can restore and establish it both legislatively and practically.
Some people believe that it is not very comfortable to talk about the restoration of historical names in Crimea in the 33rd year of Ukraine's independence. This thesis, why Ukraine did not restore justice earlier, is actively promoted by the Russian occupiers in Crimea in an attempt to compromise Ukraine. But at the same time, Ukraine has gone through a difficult path to understand the importance of dehumanization, de-russification, and decolonization. And now it is Crimea's turn for this. Head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, Rafat Chubarov, considers the question of returning historical names not only a question of returning justice to the Crimean Tatar people. He thinks this is also a question of the essence of the Ukrainian state and the strengthening of its state position in such a unique corner of Ukrainian territory, which is Crimea. Let's hear what he has to say.
The main 3 stages of renaming Crimea. It was a decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the RSFSR, dated December the 14th, 1944, almost a few months after the Crimean Tatars were deported. Then there was the decree of August 21, 1945, when the status of Crimea was changed. There was also the decree dated May 18th, 1948. About 1,000 places were renamed by those acts. There were many other smaller-scale renamings. That's why I say there were more than 1,000 renamings. But not only settlements were renamed. It was also rivers, mountains, different places, lakes, and so on. And there were many renamings that were then propagated by literature, mass media, and by electric means. Those aliens have been in Crimea for a long time. They don't say, "old dog," They say Medved Gora. But there is no Medved Gora in Crimea. There is Aodag. And if someone wants to know how it's translated, they can translate it for themselves. When we, Crimean Tatars, speak about the expansion of schools with the Ukrainian language being used for school teaching in Crimea, when we speak about Ukrainian as the state language in Crimea, when we advocate for other changes that strengthen the Ukrainian state, we do it consciously, realizing that it gives us, the Crimean Tatars, guarantees of our preservation and our development as part of the Ukrainian state. And our expectations from the majority of Ukrainian society is an awareness that the return of justice to the indigenous people of Crimea, to Crimea as an integral part of the Ukrainian state, is the path that strengthens the Ukrainian state in all its lands, including Crimea. There can be no double approaches in society either. The city of Mariupol cannot be called Zhdanov, just as Aqua cannot be Sevastopol. For if it is Sevastopol, it will always remain the city of Russian glory. But no one will ever say Aqua is the city of Russian glory. This is impossible. Agmezhd, with its century-old history, cannot have been founded in 1700. I don't remember what they think, maybe 1786 or 1787, since the conquest of Crimea. There is Kibir Jami, a 500-year-old mosque there today, and they say the town is 250 or 240 years old. This cannot be true. It's absurd. That's why it is very important that all of our values, touchstones, on which we are now restoring an independent Ukrainian state, be equally implemented throughout Ukraine, including in relation to Crimea and the Crimean Tatar people.
You've been watching a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian War, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!